I walked into my daughter-in-law's Christmas party, dressed like a broke, harmless old man, letting everyone believe I barely got by. I watched the smiles fade, the looks turn cold, and the insults slip out when they thought I had nothing to offer. They thought I was invisible. They thought I was weak. What they didn't know was that I was there to see who they really were. And that before the night ended, the truth about me would leave the entire room stunned into silence. Before I explain how that night unfolded, do me a small favor. Stay with the story until the end, and let me know where you're listening from. Stories like this travel only when people recognize themselves in them. My name is Arthur Calloway. I'm 78 years old, widowed, and, by all outward appearances, just another quiet old man living alone in a modest apartment in Westbridge, Illinois. I've spent most of my life keeping my head down, not because I had to, but because I chose to. I learned early on that the loudest people are rarely the strongest, and that real power doesn't need an audience. My son Daniel grew up believing I lived paycheck to paycheck. To him, I was a father who left early for work, came home tired, cooked simple meals, and wore the same coat year after year. He assumed I had a small office job, maybe middle management at best. I never corrected him. Money was never something I wanted shaping his values or defining my role in his life. What Daniel never knew was that for more than 30 years, I had been a senior regional operations director at Northstar Global Holdings, overseeing multiple states, managing enormous budgets, and earning nearly $40,000 a month. I signed contracts worth more than most people would see in a lifetime, and yet I lived quietly, invested carefully, and kept my life intentionally simple. I didn't need luxury to feel successful. Daniel married Elena 3 years ago. She was intelligent, ambitious, and composed. Her parents, Cynthia and Richard Holloway, were something else entirely. From the moment I first met them at the wedding, I sensed it. The way their eyes scanned people, the way every conversation eventually circled back to status, money, or influence. They weren't openly rude. They were worse. They were polite in a way that measured worth. So when Daniel called me a few days before Christmas, asking if I'd attend dinner at Elena's parent home, I noticed a hesitation in his voice. "They really want the whole family together," he said. I asked him calmly what they knew about me. There was a pause before he admitted he'd told them I lived simply, that I worked in an office, that I didn't have much. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it carefully, like he was trying not to embarrass me. That was when I decided I wouldn't correct the picture he'd painted. If they believed I was a struggling old man, I would let them believe it. I wanted to see how they treated someone they thought had nothing to offer. On Christmas night, I dressed the part. Worn shoes, an old wool coat, no jewelry, no watch. I carried a tin of homemade cookies as a gift. Nothing expensive, nothing impressive. The Holloway's house was enormous, glowing with decorative lights that screamed excess. The moment I stepped inside, conversation slowed. Cynthia greeted me with a smile that felt rehearsed. Richard shook my hand briefly, already looking past me. Daniel hugged me a little too tightly. Elena kissed my cheek and quickly turned away. As the evening went on, it became clear where I ranked. Conversations shifted when I approached. Questions about my life were shallow and quickly abandoned. Cynthia spoke at length about overseas properties, luxury hotels, and private investments, occasionally glancing my way as if expecting admiration. At dinner, I was placed at the far end of the table. No one asked if I wanted wine. Cynthia ordered for me without asking, choosing something simple. The comments followed soon after. "It must be difficult living alone at your age," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "On a limited income." I smiled and said I managed just fine. She sighed and called me brave. Richard spoke about the importance of protecting young couples from unnecessary burdens, his eyes briefly meeting mine. Daniel stared at his plate. Elena stayed silent. By the time dessert arrived, the tone had shifted completely. Cynthia leaned forward, folded her napkin neatly, and suggested they could help me financially, just a small monthly allowance, so Daniel wouldn't have to worry about me. I thanked her politely and said nothing more. I let them believe they were generous, superior, and in control. I let the night continue exactly as they wanted it to. Because I hadn't come there to impress anyone. I had come to observe. The room felt heavier after Cynthia made her offer, not because of what she said, but because of how comfortably she said it, as if deciding the value of another human being was no different than selecting a bottle of wine. I noticed how Richard nodded along, how Daniel shifted in his chair, how Elena kept her eyes fixed on her dessert plate, like if she didn't look up, none of it would be real. I accepted Cynthia's words with a small, quiet nod. I thanked her. I even told her it was kind of them to worry. That seemed to satisfy her. People like Cynthia don't want resistance. They want agreement. They want to feel benevolent. The conversation moved on, but the tone never recovered. Everything that followed carried a faint edge of judgment. When I spoke, responses were short. When I stayed silent, no one noticed. They discussed ski trips, investment portfolios, friends with vacation homes in Aspen and Milan. Richard laughed loudly at his own stories. Cynthia corrected him when he understated numbers. Elena smiled on cue. I watched my son carefully. Daniel wasn't cruel. He wasn't mocking me. But he also wasn't defending me. He sat there torn between two worlds, one that raised him to value humility and effort, and another that rewarded appearances and control. I could see the confusion in his eyes, and it hurt more than any insult Cynthia delivered. When dinner finally ended, Cynthia insisted on packing leftovers for Daniel and Elena. Nothing for me. I didn't mind. I thanked them again, wished them a Merry Christmas, and reached for my coat. At the door, Cynthia touched my arm lightly. "We'll talk more about the support," she said softly, like it was already decided. "No rush." I smiled. Of course. The cold night air outside felt like relief. Daniel walked me to the curb. He apologized, not directly, not clearly, but in fragments. Said his in-laws could be intense. Said they meant well. Said he hoped I wasn't offended. I told him I was fine. And I was, at least on the surface. Back in my apartment, I sat in silence for a long time. I replayed the evening not with anger, but with clarity. I'd seen exactly what I needed to see. The quiet dismissals. The calculated generosity. The way kindness disappeared the moment they believed someone had nothing to offer in return. What surprised me most wasn't Cynthia or Richard. It was Elena. She hadn't spoken up once. Over the next few days, Christmas came and went. I received polite texts, generic holiday wishes. Nothing more. No follow-up about the support, which told me the offer wasn't about helping. It was about positioning, about establishing hierarchy. Then, 2 days after Christmas, Daniel came to see me alone. He looked exhausted. We sat at my small kitchen table, drinking coffee from mismatched mugs. He asked if he could be honest. I told him he always could. "They think you're struggling," he said carefully. "They're worried I'll end up responsible for you." I met his eyes. "Do you feel responsible for me?" He hesitated. "Sometimes." "Yeah." That hurt, but it also opened the door. I told him I wasn't struggling. I told him I was comfortable. I didn't give numbers. I didn't give titles. But I told him I planned my life carefully and didn't need anyone's charity. He looked relieved, confused, and embarrassed all at once. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. I answered honestly. Because I wanted him to build his life without leaning on mine. Because money changes the way people listen. Because I wanted him to value effort, not safety nets. He nodded slowly. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. Cynthia and Richard had already started suggesting boundaries. How often I should visit. Whether holidays should rotate. How much influence I should have. All framed as what's best for marriage. That was when I understood the full picture. The dinner hadn't been about meeting me. It had been about evaluating me. And I had passed into the category they could manage. That night, after Daniel left, I made a decision. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of necessity. If they believed I was weak, they would treat me that way forever. And if my son didn't see the full truth, he would always be caught in the middle. I wasn't going to live the rest of my life being politely erased. I picked up my phone and sent one message to Cynthia. "Thank you again for Christmas dinner. I'd like to host the next family gathering at my place. Something small, something personal." She replied within minutes. Oh, Arthur, that's very sweet, but you don't need to trouble yourself. I smiled to myself as I typed back. I insist. Because the next time we sat across from each other, the rules would be different, and they didn't know it yet. But the quiet old man they had dismissed was about to speak. Cynthia's reply came 10 minutes later, polite and measured, the way people respond when they don't want to say yes but don't know how to say no. That's generous of you, Arthur. Let us talk it over. I knew what that meant. She didn't want to step into my space. Not because she was busy, but because she assumed there was nothing there worth seeing. Still, declining outright would look bad, especially after her performance of generosity at Christmas. 2 days later, she confirmed. Early January. A Saturday evening. Just family. I spent the week preparing. Not the way most people would expect. I didn't redecorate. I didn't buy anything new. I didn't change a thing. My apartment in Westbridge had always been clean, orderly, modest. The furniture was old but solid. Bookshelves filled with well-worn hardcovers. Framed photos of Daniel as a boy. No artwork worth mentioning. No visible signs of wealth. That was intentional. The only thing I did differently was make a few phone calls. Quiet ones. By Saturday afternoon, everything was ready. Daniel and Elena arrived first. Elena looked tense the moment she stepped inside. She glanced around like she was searching for something. Confirmation, maybe, that her parents had been right about me. She didn't find it. Daniel hugged me. He looked relieved, almost grateful to be back in a space that felt familiar and uncomplicated. Elena smiled politely and offered a bottle of wine. Mid-range. Safe. Chosen not to offend. Cynthia and Richard arrived 10 minutes later. They paused at the door. I saw it immediately. The flicker of surprise. Not disappointment. Exactly. More like confusion. They had expected worse. Something cramped. Something neglected. Instead, they found a space that was simple but warm, quiet but dignified. Cynthia recovered quickly, complimented the cleanliness, the cozy feel. Richard nodded and said it was practical. They sat. I served dinner myself. Nothing fancy. Roast chicken, vegetables, bread I'd baked that morning. Wine poured evenly. No one went without. Conversation stayed surface level at first. Weather, work, Elena's promotion, Richard's latest business venture, Cynthia's travel plans. Then, slowly, the questions began. So, Arthur, Richard said, swirling his glass, how long have you lived here? Almost 15 years. That's quite some time, Cynthia added. You must be very attached. I am. She smiled tightly. Have you ever thought about downsizing? Or maybe moving closer to Daniel and Elena? There it was. I answered calmly. I like where I am. Richard leaned back. At your age, it's important to think ahead. Comfort, support. Daniel stiffened. I looked at Richard and said evenly, I've been thinking ahead my entire life. An awkward silence followed. Cynthia filled it by asking Elena about work. I let the evening continue. I let them circle the same ideas. Concern disguised as advice. Control wrapped in courtesy. They spoke as if I weren't in the room, then remembered me only when it suited their narrative. After dessert, Cynthia cleared her throat. Arthur, she said gently, we've been thinking about our conversation from Christmas. I nodded. We just want to make sure everyone is secure, especially as life changes. She paused. We don't want Daniel feeling stretched or worried. I set my fork down. Worried about what? I asked. She smiled. You know, the future. Richard chimed in. It's only natural. Parents age. Needs arise. I met their eyes. And you think those needs fall to my son? Cynthia tilted her head. Family takes care of family. Daniel finally spoke. Mom doesn't need taking care of. Cynthia waved him off gently. Of course not now. But later. I leaned back in my chair. You're very comfortable planning my future, I said calmly. Her smile tightened. We're just being realistic. No, I replied. You're being presumptuous. The room went still. Elena looked between us, Anxious. Daniel's jaw clenched. Richard frowned. Arthur, there's no need to be defensive. I'm not, I said. I'm being clear. I stood up slowly and walked to the bookshelf by the wall. From the outside, it looked like any other shelf. What Cynthia and Richard didn't know was that behind one row of books was a slim, locked cabinet built into the wall. Hidden. Intentional. I unlocked it and pulled out a single folder. Returned to the table. Placed it gently in front of Cynthia. What's this? She asked. Context, I said. She hesitated, then opened it. Her eyes scanned the first page, then froze. Richard leaned in. Daniel leaned forward. Elena covered her mouth. Inside were printed statements, investment summaries, titles, compensation breakdowns, company letterhead. Cynthia's face drained of color. This can't be right, she whispered. It is, I said. I raised my voice. I didn't smile. I earned just under $40,000 a month. I continued evenly. I have for many years. Silence swallowed the room. Richard cleared his throat. You said you worked in an office. I do. Daniel stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. Dad, I never lied. I said gently. I just never explained. Cynthia looked up slowly. Her eyes no longer held pity. They held calculation. Fear. Something else. How much is your net worth? She asked before she could stop herself. Daniel snapped. Mom. I held up a hand. That's not information you need, I said calmly. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Arthur, if this is true, it is... Cynthia closed the folder with trembling fingers. The air in the room had changed completely. No more concern, only shock, and something dangerously close to regret. Because in that moment, they realized something far worse than their misjudgment. They realized they had exposed exactly who they were, to someone they could no longer look down on. And they didn't yet understand what that would cost them. The silence that followed felt suffocating. No one reached for their glass. No one spoke. The ticking wall clock suddenly sounded loud enough to measure every second of discomfort spreading across the table. Cynthia was the first to recover, but not with grace. Her posture changed. Her shoulders straightened. Her eyes sharpened. The pity vanished completely, replaced by something colder and more calculating. I don't understand, she said slowly. If this is true, why live like this? I met her gaze. Because I can. Richard leaned back, folding his arms. You let us believe. I let you believe what you assumed, I corrected calmly. I never once claimed to be poor. Daniel finally found his voice. Dad, all these years, I looked at my son with quiet honesty. I wanted you to build your life without depending on mine. I wanted you to respect effort, not inheritance. I never hid out of shame. I hid out of intention. Elena looked like she might cry. Why didn't you tell me? Because it never mattered, I said gently, until it did. Cynthia exhaled sharply. This changes things. No, I replied. It reveals them. Her eyes flicked toward the folder again, like it might vanish if she didn't keep track of it. We were only trying to protect our daughter. By deciding my value, I asked, by offering me money to stay out of my son's life? Richard bristled. That's not what we meant. It's exactly what you meant, I said evenly. You simply didn't expect me to be someone you needed to respect. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly. You talked about my father like he was a burden. Cynthia turned to him. Daniel, we were worried about you. You were worried about control, he shot back. That surprised her. She wasn't used to resistance. Elena finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. You humiliated him. At Christmas. Right in front of us. Cynthia's mouth opened, then closed. We were being realistic. I stood slowly, resting my hands on the table. You were being honest. And that's what matters. I walked back to the bookshelf and returned the folder to its place, locking the cabinet. When I turned back around, I saw it, the shift. They no longer saw me as fragile. They saw me as dangerous. Richard cleared his throat. Arthur, perhaps we should all take a breath. This doesn't need to become adversarial. I smiled slightly. It already did. You just didn't realize when... Cynthia's voice softened, forced. We apologize if anything came across the wrong way. That's not an apology, Daniel said. She looked at him sharply. Excuse me? You're apologizing for how it sounded, not for what you believed. The room cracked open at that moment. Elena reached for Daniel's hand. I don't want this to continue like this, she said. I don't want money deciding who matters. Cynthia stiffened. We gave you everything. You gave me pressure, Elena replied, and fear, and the belief that love comes with conditions. Richard stood abruptly. This is getting out of hand. No, I said quietly. This is getting honest. I took a breath. My voice stayed calm, but every word landed with weight. You came into my life assuming superiority. You judged me. You measured me. You tried to manage me. And you did it comfortably, because you believed I had no power. Cynthia's face flushed. We didn't know. And that's the point, I said. You didn't know. And you didn't care to. Daniel stood now, fully. This stops now. Cynthia stared at him. Daniel. No, he said. You don't get to decide what my father is worth, or how often he sees us, or whether he's a future concern. Richard scoffed. So now you're choosing him over your wife's family? Daniel didn't hesitate. I'm choosing decency. The word hit harder than shouting ever could. Elena squeezed his hand, tears streaming. I agree. Cynthia looked genuinely stunned. After everything we've done for you, Elena wiped her eyes. That doesn't give you ownership of us. I watched them carefully. This was a moment that mattered. Not the reveal of money, not the shock, but whether my son and daughter-in-law would step out of the shadow cast by wealth. Richard grabbed his coat. We're leaving? Cynthia hesitated, then stood as well. She turned toward me, her voice brittle. You humiliated us. I held her gaze. You humiliated yourselves. She looked like she wanted to say more, but no words came. She turned and followed Richard to the door. I walked him out without another word. When the door closed behind them, the apartment felt lighter, quieter, honest. Elena broke down then, sobbing into Daniel's chest. He held her tightly. I didn't know, she cried. I swear I didn't. I believe you, I said gently. But now you do know. She nodded. I don't want to be like them. Then don't, I replied. You choose who you become. Daniel turned to me. Dad, I'm sorry. I shook my head. You have nothing to apologize for. You listened. You stood up. That's all I ever wanted. We sat together for a long time that night. No lectures. No money talk. Just honesty. Before they left, Daniel hugged me longer than usual. Thank you for trusting me with the truth. I trusted you long before tonight, I said. After they were gone, I sat alone in my quiet apartment, staring at the bookshelf. I hadn't planned to reveal everything that night, but sometimes the truth decides when it's ready. And that truth had drawn a line. From now on, anyone who wanted to be part of my life would have to step across it with respect, or stay on the other side. The most interesting part? They still didn't know what would happen next. And neither did I. But for the first time in years, I felt completely unburdened. The next few weeks passed in a strange quiet. No phone calls from Cynthia. No stiff messages from Richard. No carefully worded apologies pretending nothing had happened. Just silence. And silence, I learned long ago, is rarely peace. It's preparation. Daniel called me every few days. Not with questions, not with explanations, just to talk. About work. About Elena. About small things. He sounded lighter, as if a weight he hadn't known how to name had finally been lifted. Elena came by once, alone. She didn't bring wine this time. She brought herself. She sat across from me on the same couch her parents had judged without saying so. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. I keep replaying that night, she said quietly. Every comment, every look. I didn't stop them. And that's on me. I listened. They taught me growing up that money was safety, she continued. That, without it, people become desperate, embarrassing, weak. I never questioned it because it worked for them. And then I saw how they spoke to you and how calm you stayed, and I realized something was wrong with what I'd been taught. Unlearning takes time, I said. What matters is that you're willing to do it. She nodded. They're furious. I wasn't surprised. They think you manipulated us, she added. That you set a trap. I smiled faintly. They stepped into their own reflection. Elena looked down. They're threatening to pull financial support. Daniel had mentioned already. Still, hearing it aloud mattered. And how you feel about that? I asked. She took a deep breath, terrified, but also relieved. That was the moment I knew she might be different. A week later, the silence broke. Not with an apology, with a demand. Richard called Daniel while he was at work. Not to talk, but to inform. They wanted a meeting. Formal, immediate, at their house. Daniel asked if I should come. I told him no. This is something you and Elena need to face together, I said. Not with me as a shield. He hesitated. They'll try to control the narrative. I know, I replied. Let them try. That meeting changed everything. Daniel told me later how Cynthia cried, not with remorse, but with wounded pride. How Richard lectured. How they framed their behavior as misunderstood intentions and accused Elena of betrayal. How they brought up every dollar they'd ever spent as proof of love. And how, for the first time, Elena didn't back down. She told them plainly that respect wasn't negotiable. That love wasn't ownership. That if money came with strings, they could keep it. Richard called it ungrateful. Cynthia called it manipulation. Elena called it freedom. They left that house without financial backing, without safety nets, without the approval that had governed Elena's life since childhood. And something else happened too. Cynthia sent me a message. Not long, not polite. You embarrassed us on purpose. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. No, I showed you who you were when you thought no one important was watching. Her response came seconds later. You turned our daughter against us. That one stung, but not the way she expected. I didn't turn anyone. I typed, you pushed. She didn't reply after that. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from a law firm. Not a lawsuit, a warning. It claimed my behavior at Christmas had caused emotional distress and family disruption. It hinted at reputational harm. It suggested mediation. I laughed out loud. People who weaponize money always assume it scares others the way it scares them. I made one call, not to a lawyer, to my assistant. Clear my afternoon, I said, and schedule a meeting with Sterling and Moore. By the end of the week, the threat dissolved quietly. No follow-up, no escalation, just silence again. But this time it felt different. Daniel and Elena came over for dinner that Sunday. They looked tired, but united. They told me they were downsizing plans, cutting expenses, living within what they earned. We want to build something that's ours, Daniel said, not borrowed. I nodded. That's how dignity survives. They didn't ask for help. I didn't offer. Not yet, because help given too early becomes dependency. Instead, I gave them something else. Perspective. I told them stories I'd never shared before. About working double shifts. About losing contracts. About nights I'd sat alone wondering if I'd made the wrong choices. About mistakes. About patience. Elena listened like someone drinking water after a long thirst. You never let money change you, she said softly. I smiled. It tried. Many times. She laughed through tears. I don't want to raise children the way I was raised. Then don't, I said. Raise them the way you wish you had been. When they left that night, my apartment felt warmer than it ever had. Not because of money, because of truth. A month passed. Then, too, Cynthia tried again, this time indirectly. She invited Daniel and Elena to a holiday gathering. No mention of me. No apology. Daniel declined. That was the real consequence. Not embarrassment. Not exposure. Distance. And distance for people like Cynthia and Richard was unbearable because they didn't fear poverty. They feared irrelevance. One evening, as I sat reading by the window, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. "Arthur," Cynthia said, her voice controlled but tight. "We need to talk." I closed my book. "We already have," I replied. "No," she said quickly, this time without theatrics. I paused. "You want something." A breath. "Then, we want to move forward. Then start with accountability." I said, "Not negotiation." Silence. "I'm listening," I added. Her voice cracked, not with tears but with frustration. "You don't understand how humiliating that was." I smiled sadly. "I understand exactly how humiliating it is to be reduced to what you're worth in someone else's eyes." She didn't argue, because she couldn't. "Think about what you want," I continued, "and why. If it's control, don't call me again. If it's change, show it." I hung up before she could respond. That night, I slept better than I had in years. Because for the first time, the power dynamic had shifted. Not through money, not through anger, but through boundaries. And boundaries, once drawn, don't disappear. They wait to see who respects them and who doesn't. The phone stayed quiet for a long time after that call. Weeks passed without a single message from Cynthia or Richard. No indirect pressure. No surprise invitations. No carefully worded apologies. For the first time since that Christmas dinner, the silence felt intentional, almost cautious, like they were trying to decide their next move without misstepping again. Daniel and Elena settled into a new rhythm. It wasn't easy. They cut expenses, canceled planned vacation, and learned very quickly how different life feels when money stops acting like a safety net. Daniel picked up extra consulting work. Elena turned down a role that came with prestige but little fulfillment and stayed where she could grow without feeling owned. They didn't complain. They didn't ask for help. They adjusted. That told me more about their character than any confrontation ever could. One evening, Elena called me unexpectedly. Her voice was steady, but I could hear tension underneath it. "My parents showed up at our apartment," she said. I didn't interrupt. They didn't call first. They just came. Richard talked. Cynthia cried. "A lot." She paused. Not the apologetic kind of crying. The wounded kind. "What did they want?" I asked. "To be back in control," she said honestly. "They said we were ruining the family. That we were throwing away opportunities. That we were being manipulated." I exhaled slowly. "And what did you say?" "I told them we loved them," she replied. "But we weren't negotiating our dignity." I smiled. "They didn't like that," she added quietly. "I know." She hesitated. "They mentioned you." I waited. "They said you turned us against them. That you poisoned our view. That you planned everything." I leaned back in my chair. "Did you believe them?" "No," she said immediately. "But it still hurt. Because part of me wishes they could just see it. People who confuse control with love rarely do." I replied. She was silent for a moment. Then she said something that surprised me. "They're scared of you." I let that sit. "Not because of your money," she continued, "but because you didn't need them, and because you didn't beg." That was the truth of it. A few days later, the first boundary was crossed. Not loudly, not aggressively. Subtly, I received a call from a bored acquaintance I hadn't spoken to in years. He danced around the subject before finally getting to the point. "Arthur, I thought you should know. There are some odd questions being asked about you, about your family situation." I closed my eyes briefly. "What kind of questions?" "About your mental clarity, your living arrangements, whether you're being influenced." That was when I knew. Cynthia and Richard had changed tactics. They couldn't control me directly, so they tried to reframe me. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat very still for a long time. People like them don't escalate emotionally. They escalate strategically. Within days, it became clear what they were attempting. They weren't accusing me outright. They were planting seeds. Quiet concerns. Polite doubts. The kind that grow when watered by money and connections. They wanted to make me the problem. Not angry, not vengeful, unstable. I didn't react publicly. I didn't call them. I didn't warn Daniel or Elena right away. Instead, I documented everything. Every message, every indirect inquiry, every sudden check-in from people who had never cared before. Then I made 3 phone calls. 1 to my attorney, 1 to my physician, and 1 to my financial trustee. By the end of that week, my affairs were airtight. Medical evaluations documented. Independent assessments secured. Legal protections reinforced. Then I waited. The next move came through Elena. Her parents invited her to lunch. Alone. She went against Daniel's instincts. She wanted to see if there was anything left to salvage. She came back pale. They suggested you might be slipping, she told me later. That maybe you're confused about your finances. That maybe you've been hiding things because you're afraid. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, not fear, but disappointment so deep it was almost physical. That's a serious accusation, I said. I know, she whispered. And when I challenged them, Richard said it might be time for professional oversight. They had said it out loud. That crossed the line. That evening, I invited Daniel and Elena over. I told them everything. Calmly. Completely. Daniel was furious. Elena cried. Not for herself, but for the final loss of illusion. They would really do that, she said. Not a question. Yes, I replied. Because to them, power is protection. And losing it feels like danger. Daniel stood up and paced. We're done. Completely done. No, I said gently. You're not. He turned to me. What do you mean? You don't get free by cutting people off in anger, I said. You get free by standing firm without hatred. Elena wiped her eyes. What do? I looked at them both. We let them reveal themselves. 2 days later, Cynthia called me again. This time, her voice was different. Controlled. Careful. Almost rehearsed. Arthur, she said, we're worried about you. I didn't respond immediately. There have been conversations, she continued. People are concerned you're isolating yourself. I smiled faintly. I'm listening, I said. We think it would be wise to have a neutral third party involved. Someone to help manage things before they become complicated. Manage what? I asked. Your assets, your decisions, your relationships. There it was. I took a breath. Cynthia, are you suggesting I'm incapable? No, she said quickly. Not incapable. Vulnerable. I paused long enough for the silence to stretch. Then you should be very careful what you say next. I replied. She swallowed audibly. We're only trying to help. No, I said calmly. You're trying to regain control. She bristled. You're being unreasonable. I smiled. That's what people say when they're denied leverage. She raised her voice slightly. You humiliated us. You broke our family. You did that yourselves. I replied, I only stopped pretending. She went quiet. I have documented every attempt you made to question my capacity. I continued. Every message, every intermediary, every suggestion of oversight. Her breathing quickened. If you proceed, I said softly, you will be the ones answering questions. Silence. You don't have authority over me, I added. And you never did. She didn't argue, because she knew. A week passed, then another, and then, unexpectedly, something shifted. Richard requested a meeting. Not with me, with Daniel. Daniel went. He came back shaken. They're backing off, he said, but not because they understand, because they're scared. Scared of what? Elena asked. Exposure, he replied. Consequences. Cynthia had realized something too late. That money protects you only as long as no one looks too closely. And I had made it very clear that I was willing to let people look. The rumors stopped. The inquiries dried up. The concern evaporated, because concern, when unsupported, collapses quickly. Weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from Cynthia. No accusations. No demands. Just one line stood out. We didn't expect you to stand your ground so quietly. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Quiet strength unsettles people who rely on noise. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal. Daniel and Elena grew more confident, more grounded, more themselves. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace that wasn't borrowed. Peace that didn't depend on being understood. Peace that came from knowing exactly who I was and refusing to let anyone redefine it. They hadn't won. But more importantly, neither had I, because winning had never been the point. The point was no longer being small for anyone else's comfort. And that lesson had finally landed. The month that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful in the fragile way silence sometimes feels after conflict, but steady, solid, like a house whose foundation has finally finished settling. Daniel and Elena stopped bracing for the next call. The flinching faded. The tension in their shoulders softened. They began making choices without first asking, "What will your parents think?" Or, "Will this upset them?" That question had ruled their lives longer than they realized. One afternoon, Elena came over alone. She brought homemade soup and bread, the kind you make when you want to care for someone without making it obvious. We sat at my small kitchen table, steam rising between us. "I've been thinking a lot," she said. I waited. "My parents taught me that love meant sacrifice," she continued. "But only one way. You sacrifice. You comply. You earn approval." I nodded. "And you showed me something different," she said quietly. "That love can exist without obedience. That respect doesn't come from fear." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a woman who was finally stepping out of shadows she lived under her entire life. "That realization will cost you," I said gently. "I know," she replied. "It already has." She told me Cynthia had stopped calling entirely. Richard sent short, formal messages on holidays. Polite, distant, transactional. "They're punishing us with absence," she said. "Or at least they think they are." "And how does it feel?" I asked. She thought for a moment, lighter than I expected. Daniel joined us later that evening. He had lines on his face he didn't have before, but they weren't worry lines. They were resolve. "I turned down a partnership offer today," he said. Elena looked surprised. "You didn't tell me." "I wanted to be sure first," he replied. "It would have meant reporting to one of Richard's old associates. Strings attached." I smiled faintly. And "I don't want strings anymore," he said. "Even golden ones." That night, after they left, I sat alone with my thoughts. I thought about how close things had come going very differently. If I had shouted at that dinner, if I had exposed my wealth angrily, if I had humiliated them with theatrics instead of letting them reveal themselves. People often think strength has to be loud, but real strength doesn't rush. It waits. Winter turned into spring. Cynthia never apologized. Not truly. There were hints, carefully phrased lines. We didn't mean things the way they came out. Emotions were high. Everyone misunderstood each other. But there was never accountability. And that told me everything I needed to know. One afternoon, months later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Richard. His voice was lower than I remembered, less polished. "We need to talk," he said. "No," I replied calmly. "You want to talk?" A pause. "Yes," he corrected. "About what?" I asked. "About moving forward." I leaned back in my chair. Moving forward requires knowing where you went wrong. Silence. "I don't think you're ready for that conversation," I continued. "And I won't participate in another one-sided performance." His voice tightened. "You're holding a grudge." "No," I said. "I'm holding a boundary." "There's a difference." He exhaled sharply. "You've changed." I smiled to myself. "No." I stopped adapting. That was the last time we spoke. Daniel and Elena invited me for dinner one Sunday evening. Their place looked different. Simpler, warmer, more lived in. Fewer expensive objects. More intention. After dessert, Daniel cleared his throat. "We decided something," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." We're planning to start a family, Elena said softly. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with emotion. There's something we wanted to ask you, Daniel added, if you'd be willing. I waited. We want our kids to know you, Elena said, not just as a grandfather figure, but as an example of how to live without becoming hard, of how to have strength without cruelty. I swallowed. I'd be honored, I said. She smiled, eyes bright. Good, because we don't want them growing up thinking love has a price tag. Neither did I. That night, after I returned home, I sat by my window as the city lights flickered on one by one. I thought about the woman at the park who fed pigeons, about the taxi driver who recognized truth when he saw it, about how many people mistake wealth for worth. Cynthia and Richard still had their money, their properties, their connections, but they had lost something far more fragile: control over the narrative. They would tell their version of events for years, to friends, to relatives, to anyone who would listen. But it wouldn't matter, because the people who mattered already knew the truth. Daniel and Elena built a life on their terms, quietly, intentionally, without asking permission. And I returned to my routines: early mornings, strong coffee, long walks, simple meals. People often ask me now if I regret pretending that night. I don't, because pretending to be poor taught me something priceless. It showed me who confuses kindness with weakness, who mistakes humility for insignificance, who believes money is character. And it reminded me of something I almost forgot after decades of success: that the greatest power you can have is the ability to walk away without needing to prove anything. I didn't win that night. I reclaimed myself, and that was more than enough. If this story made you think, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe, leave a comment about where you're watching from, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your small action helps these stories reach the people who might be living through something similar right now.